Do the peoples of the world not understand that in fighting to the bitter end, I am not only fulfilling my sacred duty to my people, but also standing guard over the last citadel of collective security? Are they so blind that they cannot see I bear responsibility before all humanity? If they do not come, then I will say prophetically and without bitterness, the West will perish. Haile Selassie I, Emperor of Ethiopia. On October 3, 1935, at 5 in the morning, Italian forces began their invasion of Ethiopia. The morning started with air raids on the city of Adwa and ground offensives from Somalia in the south and Eritrea in the north. The international response was painfully familiar. The League of Nations declared Italy the aggressor and imposed economic sanctions, which, however, did not include oil, coal, or metals. On June 30, 1936, after addressing the League of Nations, Selassie said, "Today it is us. Tomorrow it will be you." In December 1936, the British proposed a peace plan to Ethiopia, which required the Ethiopians to make concessions to the aggressor, including territorial ones. Ethiopia rejected the plan. The Second Italo-Ethiopian War ended on February 19, 1937, with the annexation of Ethiopia. And on September 1, 1939, the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein began shelling Westerplatte. World War II had begun. A war that involved the French, the Americans, and the British, who had offered the Ethiopians capitulation instead of help in their struggle. But how could anyone have predicted that the Italians' war in Africa was only the beginning of a conflict that would become the greatest geopolitical catastrophe in human history? What were the signs that the world was once again heading toward mass self-destruction? Why did world leaders remain passive even when it was already clear that war was inevitable? World War I ended, first and foremost, with a colossal loss of human life. About 20 million people killed and over 20 million wounded. For Germany specifically, the approximate figures were as follows: 2 million soldiers killed, 4.2 million wounded, and about 1.2 million missing or taken prisoner. Around 700,000 civilians died, and between 800,000 and 1 million people were left homeless. This in a country with a pre-war population of 68 million. In addition to the mass loss of its own population, Germany also suffered from starvation, most notably during the turnip winter of 1916–17, endured hyperinflation, and became consumed by conspiracy theories about a stab in the back by Jews or betrayal by the generals. The country was rocked by mass strikes and uprisings, which ultimately led to revolution, the fall of the monarchy, and the collapse of the German Empire. And then came the Treaty of Versailles. Germany officially accepted guilt for the war, something the Germans deeply resented. It was required to pay reparations amounting to 132 billion gold marks, more than 400 billion euros in today's money. That would be the equivalent of every German today paying over 4,500 euros. Germany also agreed to severe military restrictions: a maximum of 100,000 soldiers, a ban on tanks, military aircraft, and submarines, and the creation of a demilitarized Rhineland zone. The country lost 13% of its territory and was forbidden from uniting with Austria under any name or form. In short, Germany went from being an empire to a defeated state. Germans knew this, and they hated it, especially since wartime propaganda had fed them the belief that the war was going according to plan and would soon be won, because the fighting never reached German soil. In 1923, French troops occupied the Ruhr, adding to Germany's national humiliation. The result of all this? Hyperinflation, unemployment, and starvation. To be specific, in 1914, $1 US was worth 4.2 marks. By 1923, it was worth 4.2 trillion marks. About 2 million Germans lost their jobs due to factory closures. In some sectors, unemployment reached 25%. During the winter of 1918 to 1919, over 700,000 Germans died of hunger and disease, many of them children and the elderly. That was a post-war life in Germany. It's not hard to see how society began to demand a new leadership that would deliver fast and real change. It was in these conditions that the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, began to take shape. After joining the small radical party DAP, Adolf Hitler quickly rose to a leading position within it. In 1920, the party changed its name to the NSDAP, and soon its logo, the swastika, was introduced. The party offered simple answers to complex questions. The culprits were the Jews, the socialists, the Treaty of Versailles, and the Weimar democracy. In 1923, the NSDAP attempted to seize power in Munich. This coup, known as the Beer Hall Putsch, failed. Hitler was arrested, but the trial turned into a platform for his propaganda. He was sentenced to 5 years but served less than 1, in a relatively comfortable fortress. It was there that he dictated his book, Mein Kampf. After the failure of the violent route, the NSDAP changed its strategy. From then on, their goal was to come to power through elections. The economic crisis of 1929 and the Great Depression crushed the economy. Unemployment in Germany reached 6 million. Public trust in the government collapsed. And amid this chaos, the NSDAP promised order, jobs, and national greatness. In the July 1932 elections, the Nazis became the largest party in the Reichstag, but they failed to form a coalition. After a series of political manipulations and pressure from conservative elites, on January 30th, 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Hitler as Reich Chancellor. A few weeks later, the Reichstag was set on fire, a state of emergency was declared, and the end of the Weimar democracy began. Italy also faced a post-war crisis. The country had lost 1.2 million people. Italians considered themselves among the victors of World War I, but in reality, they received little of what had been promised, especially in terms of territorial gains. The people felt usata e tradita, betrayed and used. This national humiliation laid the groundwork for revanchist ideas. After 1919, the so-called Red Years began, a period of strikes, riots, and factory seizures. Workers and peasants were inspired by the Russian Revolution. The bourgeoisie and middle class began to fear a similar uprising and started looking for a strong hand. War veterans returned to a ruined economy with unemployment, inflation, and food shortages. The weakness of Italian democracy became clear. Parliaments were unstable, and governments changed frequently. The authorities no longer looked capable of restoring order. In 1919, Benito Mussolini founded the Fascist Party, promising exactly what many longed for: order, the restoration of a great Italy, and resistance to the Red Threat. The Blackshirts began attacking and killing left-wing activists. Thousands were murdered. In 1922, Mussolini led the March on Rome, which resulted in the establishment of a fascist dictatorship in Italy. Russia also deserves mention here. The empire lost about 1.8 million soldiers, with another 4.9 million wounded. Failures on the front lines, mass conscription, and severe shortages of weapons and food deepened social discontent. In February 1917, mass strikes and protests in Petrograd sparked the February Revolution, forcing Emperor Nicholas II to abdicate. Later that same year, the October Revolution took place, during which the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, seized power. This marked the beginning of a brutal and bloody civil war that lasted from 1917 to 1922 and claimed millions more lives. We are not fighting against individual persons. We are exterminating the bourgeoisie as a class. Do not look in the investigation for evidence or proof that the accused acted in word or deed against Soviet government. The first question we must ask is, to which class does he belong? What is his origin, education, upbringing, or profession? These questions must determine the fate of the accused. That is the essence and meaning of Red Terror. Martin Latsis, Soviet Party official and Cheka OGPU officer. As is well known, the Bolsheviks won the Civil War, and Russia was transformed into the Soviet Union. The territory of the former empire was devastated. According to various estimates, between 7 and 12 million people died, not only in combat, but also from famine, disease, repression, and mass executions. The economy was in ruins. By 1921, industrial output had fallen to just 20% of its pre-war level. Railroads barely functioned, villages were exhausted by food requisitions, and millions of peasants lived in chronic hunger. In 1921 to 1922, a famine in the Volga region claimed more than 5 million lives. Some areas were so isolated from aid that cases of cannibalism were recorded. After the failure of war communism, Lenin introduced the new economic policy, NEP, a partial return to market relations. This brought a brief recovery. Goods reappeared in markets, and private initiative revived. But the system contradicted Bolshevik ideology and was already being dismantled by the end of the decade. After Lenin's death in 1924, a power struggle began in the USSR. Eventually, Joseph Stalin emerged as the victor, gradually concentrating all power in his hands. One must also remember the Holodomor, the mass extermination of Ukrainians by the Stalinist regime in 1932 to 1933, which claimed the lives of around 4 million people. Another catalyst for war was Japan. After World War I, the country emerged on the international stage as a new power. It acquired former German colonies in China and the Pacific and became one of the victors. However, beneath the facade of modernization lay deep social contradictions and militarist ambitions. In the 1920s, Japan still maintained a parliamentary democracy, but the governments were weak, and military and nationalist forces gradually gained influence. The economy grew, but inequality was rampant. Giant zaibatsu, oligarchic corporations, controlled industry, while peasants lived in poverty. In 1923, the Great Kanto earthquake struck. Over 100,000 people were killed, and hundreds of thousands were left homeless. This disaster triggered violent pogroms against immigrants, especially Koreans, and xenophobia surged in society. In 1929, the global economic crisis hit Japan hard. Exports nearly halved. rural populations starved, and desperate families resorted to selling their children for food. These conditions fostered contempt for civilian authorities and democratic institutions. Military leaders, particularly from the Kwantung Army in Manchuria, began conducting foreign policy on their own. In 1931, without orders from Tokyo, Japanese soldiers staged an explosion on a railway line, the so-called Mukden Incident, and used it as a pretext to invade Manchuria. They established the puppet state of Manchukuo. When the League of Nations condemned the aggression, Japan simply withdrew from the League in 1933. Open militarization began, along with the ideology of Japan's Asian destiny. In schools, the emperor cult was introduced. Censorship became the norm, and by the late 1930s, Japan was an openly aggressive empire preparing for war to dominate Asia. Thus, between the end of World War I and the mid-1930s, the conditions in both Europe and Asia had aligned for the rise of radical and expansionist militarized regimes. Regimes that needed only a provocation to launch aggression, and often created those provocations themselves. After Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, Germany swiftly and systematically violated the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, beginning the reconstruction of its military might. This was a key step toward the outbreak of World War II. Starting in 1934, Germany secretly increased the size of its armed forces. In 1935, Hitler officially reintroduced compulsory military service, Wehrpflicht. This breach of international law met with no real resistance from Britain or France. By 1939, the Wehrmacht had grown to over 4.5 million soldiers. Also in 1935, the Luftwaffe, the Air Force of the Third Reich, was established. By the outbreak of war, it had become one of the most powerful air forces in the world, with thousands of aircraft built, from ground attack planes and fighters to bombers like the Heinkel and Junkers models. Alongside this militarization, the Nazis aggressively indoctrinated the younger generation. In 1936, membership in the Hitler Youth, Hitlerjugend, became mandatory for all German boys between the ages of 10 and 18. These youths were trained in discipline, marching, shooting, and propaganda, preparing them for service in the Wehrmacht. For girls, the BDM focused on preparing them to become mothers of racially pure German children. From 1935 to 1937, the Italo-Ethiopian War, mentioned at the beginning of this video, also raged. This war demonstrated the aggression of Mussolini's fascist regime in Rome and the helplessness of the League of Nations to stop it. On March 7, 1936, in violation of the Treaty of Versailles of 1919 and the Locarno Agreements of 1925, Hitler ordered about 20,000 Wehrmacht soldiers to cross the Rhine and occupy the demilitarized Rhineland, a region in western Germany along the French border, where, according to the treaty, no German troops were allowed. This was a major geopolitical provocation, as the Rhineland served as a buffer zone for France. France had the right and military capacity to respond, but hesitated without British support. Britain issued only mild criticism, claiming that Germany had merely entered its own territory. The League of Nations expressed concern, but took no concrete action. Hitler had ordered his generals to retreat if France responded with force, but there was no reaction. This emboldened him, reinforcing his sense of impunity. Meanwhile, civil war broke out in Spain between the left-wing Republic, a democratically elected government, and right-wing forces led by General Francisco Franco, who launched a military coup in July 1936. This conflict became a rehearsal for World War II, drawing in the major powers of Europe. Germany supported Franco with planes, tanks, weapons, and military advisors. It formed the Condor Legion, which bombed cities, most infamously Guernica, one of the first aerial attacks targeting civilians. Germany used the war to test its weapons and strengthen a right-wing ally. Italy sent over 70,000 soldiers, aircraft, and artillery. Supporting Franco was a way to expand fascist influence in the region. The Soviet Union backed the Republic, sending about 1,000 advisors, weapons, T-26 tanks, and I-15/I-16 fighter planes. The USSR controlled arms deliveries through the Comintern and intervened politically, including repressions against Trotskyists and anarchists within the Republican camp. Britain and France officially remained neutral through the Non-Intervention Committee, effectively doing nothing to stop Franco's backers. Meanwhile, many Europeans volunteered to fight for the Republic in the international brigades. In 1939, Franco claimed victory. Spain became an authoritarian state. Though it did not officially join the Axis during World War II, Franco sympathized with Hitler and Mussolini and offered limited support to the Third Reich. After remilitarizing the Rhineland, Hitler set his sights on expanding Lebensraum, living space, for the German people. His next target was Austria. In March 1938, the Wehrmacht entered Austria without a fight. A portion of the population welcomed the annexation, though there were Austrians who opposed it, but their voices were ignored. The very next day, Austria was officially incorporated into the Third Reich. In April, a referendum was held, claiming that over 99% voted in favor, though the outcome was predetermined and heavily falsified. Western reaction to the Anschluss was weak. Britain and France expressed diplomatic concern but took no concrete action. Hitler saw that he could violate international agreements without consequences. In September of the same year, Czechoslovakia was next. Specifically, the Sudetenland, a border region home to around 3 million ethnic Germans. Hitler declared that he had to protect them from alleged persecution. London and Paris once again saw this as a chance to avoid war. At the Munich conference, the leaders of Germany, Italy, France, and Britain gathered. But Czechoslovakia, whose fate was being decided, was not even invited. The result was an agreement that handed over the Sudetenland to Germany. Returning home, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain famously declared he had brought peace for our time. In reality, it was a step that only brought the world closer to war. The annexation of the Sudetenland had not only political but also economic consequences. Germany gained control of well-fortified defensive lines and, more importantly, access to modern arms factories and industrial infrastructure. Czechoslovakia was one of the most advanced industrial nations in Central Europe. The Škoda Arms Company alone produced hundreds of tanks, cannons, and munitions. All of this now fell into German hands, greatly boosting the Wehrmacht's military preparations. 6 months later, in the spring of 1939, Hitler broke his promises again. The Wehrmacht marched into Prague and occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia without firing a shot. A puppet state, the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, was established, while independent Slovakia came under full German control. This could no longer be justified as protecting Germans. Hitler was now openly swallowing foreign countries. After this move, it became clear. The Third Reich's appetite was insatiable, and the policy of appeasement had failed. Britain and France realized Poland would be next. In April, they gave Poland security guarantees. The world began bracing for war. Hitler's actions also influenced the countries of Eastern Europe, many of which had not yet decided which side to align with. By 1939 to 1940, Eastern European nations found themselves at a crossroads, a choice that would largely determine their fate in the Second World War. Hitler wasn't merely seizing territory. He was building a new order in Europe. And for many states, Germany seemed like a real force capable of redrawing post-war borders in their favor. Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, three countries that had lost parts of their historic territories after World War I, sought to revise the Versailles system. Hungarians wanted to reclaim Transylvania. Romanians aimed to strengthen control over Bessarabia, and Bulgarians dreamed of regaining lands they considered theirs. German support appeared to be a chance to restore historical justice. While the world's attention was focused on Europe, another bloody conflict was raging in Asia. Imperial Japan had been expanding its influence on the continent since the early 1930s, turning the region into a theater of imperial ambition. In 1937, a full-scale war broke out between Japan and China. Beijing, Shanghai, and eventually the capital Nanjing fell. In Nanjing, Japanese forces committed one of the worst atrocities of the 20th century, the Nanjing Massacre, during which up to 300,000 civilians and prisoners of war were killed in just a few weeks. Yet even this failed to provoke serious intervention by Western powers. Most viewed it as an internal Asian matter. Meanwhile, on the far eastern frontier, border clashes erupted between Japan and the Soviet Union. In 1938, fighting broke out near Lake Khasan, and in 1939, major battles occurred along the Khalkhin-Gol River in Mongolia. There, the Red Army under General Zhukov delivered a crushing defeat to the Japanese. This confrontation had major strategic consequences. Japan decided to shift its focus southward, leaving the Soviet Union alone until 1945. Thus, even before war officially began in Europe, a large-scale conflict was already raging in Asia, one that would eventually cost millions of lives. Yet this war remained on the margins of global geopolitics, at least until Japan entered the broader conflict by attacking Pearl Harbor. By the late 1930s, it was becoming increasingly clear to the world. A new Great War was inevitable, but the West was not ready to fight. In Britain and France, memories of the horrors of World War I were still vivid. Millions dead or wounded, cities in ruins, and economic instability had turned both societies deeply pacifist. Most people and politicians were convinced that another war must be avoided at any cost, and Hitler took full advantage of that mindset. After the Anschluss with Austria and the annexation of the Sudetenland in 1938, Western leaders effectively accepted the new order in Europe. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned from Munich and triumphantly declared, "I have brought peace for our time." In reality, it was not a triumph of diplomacy, but an appeasement of a dictator, one that only whetted his appetite. Meanwhile, the United States remained on the sidelines. The 1930s, America was a nation grappling with economic crisis and political isolation. Most Americans had no desire to become involved in European affairs, and Congress passed laws prohibiting the sale of weapons to nations at war. As a result, the United States remained a bystander as global tensions rose. At the same time, the Soviet Union, formerly a socialist enemy of fascism, made a shocking diplomatic move. In August 1939, Stalin and Hitler signed a non-aggression pact, the infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But the secret protocol divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland, the Baltic states, and Bessarabia were mapped out like pieces on a chessboard. Stalin bought himself time to prepare, while Hitler gained a free hand in the West. This pact was the final signal. A great war was about to begin. The world stood at the edge of the abyss, with its eyes shut. And so began the Second World War. The war everyone tried to avoid became reality, and those most fearful of it were fully engulfed. Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. 2 weeks later, on September 17th, the Soviet Union struck from the east. Stalin began his own expansion, invading Finland, annexing Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Bessarabia. But then came betrayal. On June 22, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. The war spread across the globe. Pivotal battles, Stalingrad, Kursk, Dunkirk, El Alamein, the Normandy landings, the Pacific Theater, Okinawa. Millions became soldiers. Even more became refugees, prisoners, victims. The losses were catastrophic. Over 70 million dead, most of them civilians. Cities lay in ruins. Warsaw, Stalingrad, Dresden, Coventry, Tokyo, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. For the first time in history, nuclear weapons were used. But conventional bombings claimed even more lives. From firestorms in Tokyo to the complete destruction of Hamburg. Economies were drained. Factories produced only for war. Civilians faced hunger. Entire nations were subjected to occupation, genocide, forced labor. The Holocaust became the ultimate symbol of this war's inhumanity. This tragedy taught a harsh lesson. If you want peace, prepare for war. Appeasing an aggressor only emboldens him. Peace requires strength, resolve, and the readiness to fight. History does not forgive naivety.